Sarah Chen thought she had buried her sister's ghost 20 years ago, but some secrets refused to stay dead. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital break room buzzed with their familiar harsh hum, casting everything in that sickly, institutional glow that made even the healthiest people look corpse-pale. At 42, Sarah had grown accustomed to this sterile world of antiseptic smells and endless night shifts. But tonight, something felt different. She sat hunched over her lukewarm coffee, her scrubs wrinkled from another 12-hour marathon in the cardiac unit. The clock above the vending machine read 11:47 p.m., and her body ached in that bone-deep way that only came from years of carrying other people's pain. Her phone buzzed against the laminate table, cutting through the white noise of the hospital's perpetual motion. The caller ID made her blood freeze. Detective Morrison's Seattle PD Sarah stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the decline button. In her line of work, late-night calls from police usually meant one of her patients had taken a turn for the worse, or sometimes a family member needed to be contacted about a loved one's condition. But Detective Morrison wasn't calling about her patients. She knew this with the same certainty that told her when a patient was about to crash before the monitors even started screaming. "Sarah Chen," she answered, her voice steadier than her hands. "Ms. Chen, I apologize for calling so late. This is Detective Morrison with Seattle PD. I'm calling regarding your sister Grace's case." The break room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights brighter. Grace. No one had spoken that name to her in months, maybe longer. She'd trained herself not to flinch when she heard it in passing, trained herself to breathe normally when well-meaning colleagues asked about family during holiday. Small talk. "I'm sorry, Detective, but Grace's case was closed years ago. There's nothing new to discuss." "Actually, ma'am, that's why I'm calling. We've received some new information that requires us to reopen the investigation. I'd like to meet with you and your brother David tomorrow to discuss." Sarah ended the call. Her hands trembled as she set the phone face down on the table, as if hiding the screen could somehow undo what she'd just heard. New information. After 20 years of silence, someone had decided to disturb the carefully constructed peace she'd built around her sister's disappearance. Sarah's apartment felt like a tomb in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd driven home on autopilot, her mind still reeling from Detective Morrison's call. And now she sat on her couch, staring at her phone as it buzzed insistently against the coffee table. The same number, the same detective who refused to let sleeping nightmares lie. She'd managed to avoid this conversation for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. The buzzing stopped, then immediately started again. Through her living room window, the first pale hints of sunrise crept across the Seattle skyline, painting everything in shades of gray that matched her mood. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to summon the professional composure that had carried her through 2 decades of medical emergencies, but her hands still shook as she reached for the phone. Detective Morrison. "Ms. Chen, I'm glad you answered. I understand this must be difficult, but I need you to listen to me." Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly feeling smaller than she had in years. Grace has been gone for 20 years. What could possibly be new? 3 days ago, we received an anonymous tip with specific details about your sister's disappearance, details that were never released to the public. Morrison's voice was gentle but unyielding. The caller mentioned a location where we might find evidence. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Evidence. After all this time, someone wanted to drag Grace's memory back into the light, to parade their family's grief through another investigation. She thought of David, probably just getting ready for work at his auto shop, blissfully unaware that their carefully maintained silence was about to be shattered. "Have you contacted my brother?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." "You were 18 when Grace disappeared, old enough to remember details that might help us now." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Help you with what exactly? Find a body? Prove something terrible happened to a 12-year-old girl?" "We already know something terrible happened, Detective. We've been living with it for 20 years. Ms. Chen, someone out there knows what happened to Grace, and they're finally ready to talk." The detective's words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah stared at a framed photo on her mantel, one of the few pictures of Grace she'd kept displayed. Her sister's choir dress, her bright smile, that ridiculous gap between her front teeth she'd been so self-conscious about. "Don't contact David," Sarah said finally. "Not yet. Give me 24 hours. Sarah sat in the growing daylight, Detective Morrison's words echoing in her mind, and found herself transported back to that final Sunday morning in October 2003. The memory came unbidden, as vivid as if 20 years had collapsed into nothing. She could still see Grace bouncing on her toes in the church parking lot, her white choir dress pristine, despite having worn it since dawn. At 12, Grace had possessed that particular brand of preteen energy that made adults simultaneously exhausted and envious. Her dark hair was pulled back in the elaborate French braid their mother had spent 30 minutes perfecting, and she clutched her overnight bag like it contained treasures. "Sarah, are you sure you can't come?" Grace had asked for the dozenth time, tugging on her older sister's sleeve. "Father Marcus said there's going to be a campfire and everything, and we're going to practice the Christmas songs." Sarah had been 18 then, too cool for church retreats and too focused on her college applications to spare a weekend for what she'd dismissed as kiddie camp. She'd rolled her eyes at Grace's enthusiasm, kissed her cheek in that patronizing way older sisters did, and watched her climb into the church van with a dozen other children. "Take care of her, David," Sarah had called to their 16-year-old brother, who was helping Father Marcus load the luggage. David had given her a thumbs up, his sandy hair falling into his eyes as he hefted Grace's ridiculously overpacked bag. Father Marcus had been in his early 40s then, handsome in that effortless way that made the church mothers volunteer for every committee he chaired. He'd had kind eyes and a warm smile, and Grace had absolutely adored him. All the children did. He'd made Faith feel like an adventure rather than a chore. "We'll bring her back full of stories and sugar," he'd promised Sarah, ruffling Grace's hair affectionately. "Though I can't promise she'll be ready for school Monday morning." Grace had pressed her face to the van window as they pulled away, waving frantically until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Sarah had waved back, already mentally planning the quiet weekend she'd have to herself. It was the last time she'd seen her sister alive. Now, sitting in her apartment with the morning light streaming through the windows, Sarah realized she'd spent 20 years trying to forget the details of that weekend. But Detective Morrison's call had cracked something open, and the memories were flooding back whether she wanted them or not. Someone knew what had happened to Grace. Someone had always known. Chen's Auto Repair occupied a corner lot in Georgetown, its bay doors open to let in the crisp October air. Sarah found David exactly where she'd expected, bent over the engine of a Honda Civic, his hands black with grease, completely absorbed in his work. 20 years had broadened his shoulders and lined his face, but he still had that same intense focus that had driven him to take apart every electronic device in their childhood home. "David." He straightened so quickly he banged his head on the hood. When he turned to face her, Sarah saw something she'd never seen in her brother's eyes before. Fear. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" He wiped his hands on a rag, but they continued to shake. "Shouldn't you be sleeping? You worked last night," Detective Morrison called me. She watched his face carefully, noting how his jaw tightened at the name. "He wants to reopen Grace's case." David's hands stilled. The radio in the corner played classic rock, but the music seemed to fade into background noise as the silence stretched between them. A customer honked outside, waiting for service, but David didn't move. "They said someone called in a tip," Sarah continued. "Someone with information about what happened that weekend." "Sarah, don't." David's voice was barely above a whisper. "Please don't do this." The plea in his tone stopped her cold. This wasn't the brother she remembered, the confident teenager who'd protected her from bullies and helped her with calculus homework. This David looked broken, haunted by something that went deeper than grief. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked gently. David turned away, focusing intently on organizing tools that were already perfectly arranged. "It's been 20 years. Why can't they just leave her alone? Leave us alone?" "Because someone out there knows what happened to our sister." Sarah moved closer, trying to catch his eye. "David, if you know something, anything, you have to tell them." "I don't know anything." The words came out too quickly, too rehearsed. "I was just a kid, 16 years old. How was I supposed to know what happened to her?" but his hands were shaking again, and he wouldn't look at her directly. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her chest, the same instinct that told her when a patient was hiding symptoms that could kill them. "The police are going to want to talk to you," she said quietly. "They're going to ask questions about that retreat, about Father Marcus, about—" "Don't!" David slammed a wrench down on the workbench. "Don't say his name." The venom in his voice made Sarah step back. In that moment she realized her brother had been carrying something terrible for 20 years, and it was finally eating him alive. The key to their childhood home still fit perfectly in Sarah's hand, though she hadn't used it in months. Her parents had moved to Arizona 5 years ago, unable to bear the weight of memories that clung to every corner of the house where Grace had grown up. They'd left it to Sarah and David to decide what to do with the property, but neither had been able to bring themselves to sell it. Now, standing in the dusty silence of the living room, Sarah understood why. The house held secrets. David's reaction at the auto shop had confirmed what she'd suspected. Her brother knew more about Grace's disappearance than he'd ever admitted, but 20 years of selective amnesia couldn't be undone with gentle questioning. She needed proof, something concrete to break through the wall of silence he'd built around that weekend. The attic ladder creaked under her weight as she climbed into the cramped space beneath the eaves. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, labeled in her mother's careful handwriting: Grace's school papers, Christmas decorations, photo albums, 1998-2003. Sarah's throat tightened as she realized her parents had stopped creating new photo albums after Grace disappeared, as if their family story had simply ended that October weekend. She pulled down the box marked Grace's room and carried it to the small window that provided the only natural light. Inside, she found the detritus of a 12-year-old's life. Friendship bracelets, sparkly lip gloss, a collection of smooth stones Grace had gathered from their backyard. At the bottom, wrapped in an old T-shirt, was Grace's diary. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the small book with its broken lock. Grace's handwriting was still forming, some letters perfectly cursive while others reverted to childish print. The entries were typical pre-teen concerns: complaints about homework, excitement about choir practice, frustration with David's teasing, until she reached the final week. October 15th. Father Marcus asked me to help him with something special. He said I was mature for my age and could handle grown-up responsibilities. I feel so important. October 18th. I don't think I should tell Sarah or David about my special job. Father Marcus says some people wouldn't understand. He says it's between me and God. October 20th. I'm scared to go on the retreat. But Father Marcus says if I don't come, I'll be letting everyone down. He says I made a promise to God and promises can't be broken. The final entry was dated October 21st, the day before the retreat. Something's wrong. I tried to tell David, but he just laughed. Father Marcus isn't who I thought he was. I want to stay home, but I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't go. If something happens to me, I hid the pictures where no one will find them. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Pictures. Grace had hidden pictures somewhere in this house, evidence of whatever had frightened her so badly in those final days. Evidence that had been waiting here for 20 years, waiting for someone to finally look. St. Benedict's Catholic Church sat on a hill overlooking the small town of Millfield, its white steeple piercing the grey October sky like an accusation. Sarah had driven 2 hours to get here, Grace's diary burning like a coal in her purse, the cryptic reference to hidden pictures echoing in her mind. She'd found Father Marcus's current assignment through a simple internet search, surprised that the church hadn't bothered to hide his transfer after the unfortunate incident at their old parish. The man who answered the rectory door still carried himself with the same quiet authority she remembered, though 20 years had silvered his dark hair and etched lines around his eyes. He was 62 now, according to the parish website, but his smile remained as warm and disarming as it had been when Grace was 12. "Sarah Chen," he said, as if no time had passed at all. "My goodness. Look at you, all grown up and saving. Lives I hear. Father Marcus." She kept her voice level, professional. "I hope you have a few minutes to talk." Of course, come in." He stepped aside, gesturing her into a comfortable sitting room lined with theological texts and family photos from parishioners. "Can I offer you coffee? Tea?" This isn't a social visit. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the warmth in his eyes cooling by degrees. "I see. This is about Grace, isn't it? I heard the police were asking questions again." He settled into a leather armchair, his movements deliberate and measured. "Such a tragedy. I've carried the guilt of that weekend for 20 years. Sarah studied his face, searching for cracks in the facade. "What kind of guilt, Father? A child disappeared under my supervision. What kind of shepherd loses one of his flock?" He shook his head sadly. "I've prayed for Grace every day since, and for your family's healing, of course. Grace wrote about you in her diary." Sarah watched him carefully. "About a special job you gave her, something she was supposed to keep secret." Father Marcus's hands stilled on the arms of his chair. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. Children often misunderstand adult conversations, don't they? Grace was such an imaginative girl, always creating stories, turning simple requests into grand adventures. She was terrified of you by the end. Sarah. His voice carried that same gentle authority that had once made a 12-year-old girl feel special, chosen. Grief can play terrible tricks on memory. You've been carrying this burden for so long, perhaps it's time to let it go. Grace is with God now. Isn't that enough? The casual dismissal made Sarah's skin crawl. This was the voice Grace had trusted, the authority figure who had made her feel important right up until the moment she'd realized something was terribly wrong. "The police have new evidence," Sarah said quietly. "Someone's finally ready to tell the truth about what happened that weekend." For just a moment, Father Marcus's mask slipped. Sarah saw something cold and calculating flicker across his features before the benevolent smile returned. "Well then," he said, rising from his chair. "I suppose we'll all have to trust in God's justice, won't we?" The Pine Ridge Retreat Center had seemed magical to 12-year-old Grace Chen, nestled in the Cascade Mountains like something from a fairy tale. Ancient Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral of green that filtered the October sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. The wooden cabins scattered throughout the property looked like they belonged in a summer camp brochure, complete with stone fireplaces and hand-hewn log walls. Grace had been thrilled when Father Marcus assigned her to the cabin closest to the main lodge. "You're my special helper this weekend," he'd told her with that warm smile that made her feel chosen, important. "I'll need you close by for our project." The other children had settled into their cabins after dinner, their voices carrying across the crisp mountain air as they shared ghost stories and contraband candy. David was 3 cabins away with the older boys, probably trying to impress them with his knowledge of car engines and baseball statistics. Grace had watched him through her window, feeling both proud of her big brother and oddly isolated from the easy camaraderie of the group. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Father Marcus knocked softly on her cabin door. "Grace, are you ready for our special task?" She'd been expecting this moment all weekend, though she still wasn't entirely sure what the task involved. Father Marcus had been vague about the details, saying only that it required someone mature and trustworthy, someone who understood the importance of keeping secrets for God. "I'm ready, Father," she whispered, slipping on her shoes and following him into the darkness. They walked in silence toward the old groundskeeper's shed behind the main lodge, a building that had been declared off-limits to the children earlier that day. Father Marcus produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the heavy wooden door. Inside, Grace expected to find gardening tools or maintenance equipment. Instead, she discovered something that made her stomach lurch with a sick understanding. She was too young to fully comprehend. Cameras, lights, a mattress on the floor surrounded by props that belonged in a bedroom, not a storage shed. "Father Marcus," she whispered, backing toward the door. "I don't think I should be here." His hand fell on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Grace, you made a promise to help me. Promises to God are sacred." But Grace had already seen enough. The careful setup, the secrecy, the way Father Marcus's voice had changed in the darkness of the shed. This wasn't about God at all. She ran, through the forest, branches tearing at her pajamas, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, she could hear Father Marcus calling her name, his voice no longer gentle but sharp, with something that sounded like panic. Grace had always been fast, faster than David, faster than any of the boys at school. She made it to the main lodge and burst through the front door, gasping and wild-eyed. "Help," she whispered to the empty room, but there was no one to hear her except the mountains themselves. The hospital parking garage at 3 in the morning was Sarah's sanctuary, a concrete cathedral where she'd processed 20 years of other people's tragedies. She sat in her car with the engine off, David's hunched figure visible in her rear-view mirror as he approached her vehicle. He'd agreed to meet her here after she'd called him, following her confrontation with Father Marcus, her voice shaking as she'd told him about Grace's diary entries. David slid into the passenger seat without a word, his work clothes still stained with grease despite the late hour. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older than his 36 years. He stared straight ahead through the windshield at the concrete wall, his hands clenched in his lap. "She came to me that night," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, she was terrified, crying so hard she could barely speak." Sarah's chest tightened. "What did she tell you?" She said Father Marcus had taken her to some shed, that there were cameras and... David's voice broke. "She was 12, Sarah. She didn't understand what she'd seen, but she knew it was wrong. Why didn't you tell someone?" The question came out harsher than Sarah intended. 20 years of anguish compressed into 5 words. David flinched as if she'd struck him. "I tried. I went to find him, to confront him. But when I got to his cabin, the lights were off. I thought, maybe Grace had misunderstood something. Maybe it was just, I don't know, I was 16, I didn't know what to do with what she'd told me." "So you did nothing?" "No." David turned to face her, his eyes hollow with shame. "I did worse than nothing. I convinced her not to tell anyone else. I told her it would cause trouble for the church, that people might not believe her. I said we'd handle it ourselves when we got home." The admission hung between them like a physical weight. Sarah felt her world tilt as she realized the full scope of her brother's burden. He hadn't just failed to protect Grace, he'd actively silenced her. "The next morning she was gone," David continued. "They said she must have wandered off during the night, maybe fallen into the river. But I knew Father Marcus had done something to keep her quiet. And you never told anyone, not the police, not Mom and Dad, no one." David's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "He came to me after they found her shoes by the water. He put his hand on my shoulder and said how sorry he was for our loss. But his eyes were warning me, reminding me that I was complicit. So now, that I'd helped him silence her." Sarah stared at her brother, seeing him clearly for the first time in decades. Not the protective big brother she'd idealized, but a frightened teenager who'd made a terrible choice and spent 20 years drowning in its consequences. "David," she whispered. "Someone called in that tip to the police. Someone who knows what really happened." His head snapped up, fear replacing shame in his expression. "It wasn't me." "Then who?" The Pine Ridge Retreat Center looked like a graveyard of abandoned dreams. 20 years of Pacific Northwest weather had claimed the wooden structures, leaving behind skeletal frames and moss-covered foundations. Sarah stood at the entrance to what had once been the main lodge, Detective Morrison beside her, reviewing Grace's diary for the 10th time, while David remained in the car, too broken to face the place where his silence had sealed their sister's fate. "According to the diary, Grace mentioned hiding pictures where the angels sleep," Morrison said, his breath visible in the cold mountain air. "Any idea what that meant to her?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to channel her 12-year-old sister's voice. Grace had always been fascinated by the wooden angels carved into the retreat center's chapel eaves, spending hours during previous visits staring up at their serene faces. The chapel. She loved the angel carvings there. They picked their way through the ruins, accompanied by 2 forensic technicians and a cadaver dog named Rex. The German Shepherd had already alerted at 3 different locations, his handler explaining that decades of forest animals could create false positives. But when they reached the collapsed chapel, Rex's behavior changed entirely. The dog sat perfectly still in front of what had been the altar, a low whine emanating from his throat. His handler, a weathered woman named Patterson, nodded grimly. He's never wrong when he does that. Sarah felt her legs give out as the reality hit her. Grace was here. After 20 years of wondering, of hoping against hope, that maybe her sister had somehow survived, the truth was literally beneath their feet. "We'll need to bring in the full forensic team," Morrison said quietly. "This could take days. I don't care how long it takes." Sarah's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "I've waited 20 years for answers. I can wait a few more. Days for justice." As the team began setting up their equipment, Sarah noticed David finally approaching from the parking area. His face was pale, his movements uncertain, but there was something else in his expression she hadn't seen in decades: relief. "Is it her?" he asked, though they all knew the answer. "Yeah," Sarah whispered. "It's her." David sank to his knees beside the spot where Rex had alerted, his hands pressed against the earth as if he could somehow communicate with their sister through 20 years of silence and soil. "I'm sorry, Gracie, I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." Detective Morrison's phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer it, but Sarah could hear fragments of the conversation. "Father Marcus, flight to Rome, need to move fast." When he returned, his expression was grim. "Father Marcus tried to leave the country this morning. TSA flagged his passport. He's in custody, but we need to move quickly before his lawyers shut this down." Sarah looked at the spot where her sister lay, at her brother, kneeling in the dirt, at the ruins of a place that had stolen their family's innocence. For the first time in 20 years, she felt something other than helpless grief. She felt rage. And rage, she realized, was exactly what Grace deserved. Sarah had made a mistake leaving the search site alone. She'd told Detective Morrison she needed air, needed to process what they'd found, but the truth was simpler. She'd needed to scream. The forest had always been her refuge, and she'd walked the old trail behind the retreat center without thinking, muscle memory guiding her feet along paths she'd explored as a teenager during happier church retreats. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare. Small and weathered, it sat in a clearing she didn't remember, smoke rising from its chimney despite the structure's apparent abandonment. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but something drew her forward. Perhaps it was the need to understand, to see with her own eyes the places where Grace's final hours had unfolded. She was 20 yards from the front door when it opened. Father Marcus stood in the doorway, no longer the composed priest she'd confronted at his parish. His clerical collar was gone, replaced by a simple flannel shirt and jeans. His silver hair was disheveled, and his eyes held a wildness that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," he said, his voice carrying that same gentle authority that had once comforted grieving parishioners. Grace did eventually. She was always such a curious child. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her phone, but Father Marcus shook his head with paternal disappointment. "No signal up here, I'm afraid. The mountains block everything. It's why I chose this location 20 years ago. How you're supposed to be in custody." Sarah's voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Bail is a wonderful thing when you have friends in high places." He stepped aside, gesturing her toward the cabin's interior. "Come in, Sarah. We have so much to discuss." Every instinct told her to run, but Father Marcus's hand was already on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man in his 60s. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace and basic furniture. On the mantel sat a collection of photographs that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Children from various parishes, all around Grace's age, all smiling trustingly at the camera. "You've caused me considerable trouble," Father Marcus said, closing the door behind them. Sarah heard the distinctive click of a deadbolt. 20 years of careful planning undone by a sister who couldn't leave well enough alone. "The police know you're here." "Do they?" He smiled with genuine amusement. "I told them I was visiting my sick mother in Portland. Amazing how people still trust a priest's word, Even in these cynical times, Sarah's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could serve as a weapon. But Father Marcus had positioned himself between her and the door, and she realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't a chance encounter. He'd been waiting for her. "Grace fought, you know," he said conversationally. "Right up until the end. Such spirit, such determination to be heard." The casual cruelty of the statement broke something inside Sarah. "You monster!" "Careful, child. We're going to need to discuss your future. And David's. After all, he was complicit in keeping our little secret." The sound of splintering wood shattered the cabin's oppressive silence as the front door exploded inward. David stood in the doorway, his chest heaving from the run through the forest, his eyes wild with 20 years of suppressed rage. Behind him, Sarah could see Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers picking their way through the trees. "Let her go," David said, his voice carrying a steel Sarah had never heard before. Father Marcus's grip on Sarah's arm tightened, but his composure never wavered. "David, still the protective big brother, I see, though you weren't quite so protective of Grace, were you?" "I was 16 years old." David stepped into the cabin, his hands clenched into fists. "You manipulated a child. You made me complicit in covering up your crime. I made you nothing. You chose silence." Father Marcus smiled with the same paternal warmth that had once made children feel special. "You chose to protect yourself rather than seek justice for your sister." Sarah watched her brother's face crumble as the accusation hit home. For a moment, she thought he might collapse under the weight of his guilt. But then, something shifted. In his expression, a transformation that took 20 years of shame and forged it into something harder. "You're right," David said quietly. "I did choose silence. I chose to protect a monster because I was scared and stupid and 16 years old." He took another step forward. "But I'm not 16 anymore." Detective Morrison appeared in the doorway, his weapon drawn but lowered. "Father Marcus, you're under arrest for the murder of Grace Chen and multiple counts of child endangerment. Release Ms. Chen and step away." Father Marcus laughed, the sound incongruously cheerful in the tense atmosphere. "I think not, Detective. You see, I have nothing left to lose. My career is over, my reputation destroyed, but I can still ensure that the truth dies with me." Sarah felt something cold press against her temple and realized with horror that Father Marcus had produced a gun from somewhere. The photographs on the mantel seemed to watch the scene unfold, a gallery of innocence forever captured in the moments before their trust was shattered. "David," Father Marcus said conversationally, "why don't you tell Detective Morrison about our conversation that night? About how you helped me convince Grace that reporting what she'd seen would only cause trouble. For everyone." Sarah watched her brother's face as the final piece of his shame was laid bare. But instead of crumbling, David straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the man who had stolen his sister's life and poisoned his own. "I was the one who called in the tip," David said clearly. "I couldn't live with the silence anymore. Grace deserved better than a brother who was too cowardly to speak for her." The admission hung in the air like a benediction. 20 years of secrets, finally exposed to the light. Father Marcus's mask slipped entirely, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Then you've sealed both your fates." The memorial garden bloomed with late spring flowers, their colors bright against the brick facade of Lincoln Elementary School. Sarah knelt beside the newly planted rosebush, its white petals still tender from the morning rain. The small bronze plaque at its base read simply, "Grace Chen, 1991-2003. Beloved, daughter, sister, and friend, her voice lives on." 6 months had passed since that terrible confrontation in the mountain cabin. Father Marcus was awaiting trial, his bail revoked after the attempted murder charges were added to the growing list of crimes spanning 3 decades. And multiple parishes. The media had latched onto the story with predictable fervor, but Sarah had learned to tune out the noise and focus on what mattered: healing. "The prosecution thinks they have enough evidence for a conviction," Detective Morrison said, joining her beside the memorial. "David's testimony, combined with the physical evidence and what we found in that cabin." He shook his head grimly. "Marcus won't see freedom again." Sarah nodded, though the legal proceedings felt almost secondary now. Justice mattered, but it couldn't bring Grace back or erase 20 years of pain. What mattered more were the small victories. David sleeping through the night for the first time in decades, her parents finally able to speak Grace's name without breaking down the way her brother had started smiling again. Sarah, a woman, approached tentatively, clutching a small bouquet of daisies. Sarah recognized her as Michelle Santos, one of Grace's former classmates. "I hope it's okay that I came. I needed to tell you something." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Around the garden, other figures emerged from the shadows of memory. Grace's choir friends, classmates, teachers who had never forgotten the bright 12-year-old who had simply vanished one October weekend. "Grace tried to tell me," Michelle said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The week before the retreat, she said Father Marcus made her feel uncomfortable, but I didn't. I thought she was just being dramatic." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I should have listened. You were 12 years old," Sarah said gently, the same words she'd been learning to say to David, to herself. "We all did the best we could with what we knew then." David appeared at her side, carrying a small wooden cross he'd carved himself. His hands, still permanently stained with grease from the auto shop, trembled slightly as he placed it beside the plaque. "I brought something for her." The cross was simple but beautiful, carved from Douglas fir like the trees that had surrounded the retreat center. On its surface, David had etched a single word: "Forgiven." "She would have forgiven you," Sarah said, taking her brother's hand. "Grace always forgave everyone, remember? Even when you put that spider in her backpack." David's laugh was watery but genuine. "She screamed for 10 minutes, then made me chocolate chip cookies that afternoon." As the sun set behind the school building, casting long shadows across Grace's garden, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. Truth. Love. The knowledge that Grace's story would never be forgotten, that her voice had finally been heard. The secret that had poisoned their family for 2 decades was finally buried. In its place, something new had taken root: hope.